The year was 1347, and the world was about to end. Not with fire, not with flood, but with something far more terrifying: silence. The kind of silence that comes when an entire village realizes the wells have run dry, the granaries are empty, and winter is coming 3 months early. But this isn't a story about death. No, this is a story about the techniques, the knowledge, the absolutely mind-blowing survival methods that kept our ancestors alive when everything around them was trying to kill them. Methods we've completely forgotten. Methods that might just save your life someday. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you on a journey back to a time when survival wasn't a TV show. It was Tuesday. The monastery of St. Edmund's sat perched on a hillside in what we now call East Anglia, England. Brother Thomas had been awake for 36 hours straight, and his hands were stained black up to his elbows. Not from ink, though he was a scribe. Not from soil, though he tended the gardens. No, his hands were black from something far more precious in the year of our Lord 1347. Charcoal dust mixed with rendered animal fat and crushed oak bark. He was making something that would be worth more than gold in 6 months' time. He was making soap. Real soap. The kind that could stop a plague. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back further, to where this story really begins. The thing about medieval survival techniques is that they weren't written down in neat little books with step-by-step instructions and helpful illustrations. They were passed down through whispers, through watching, through the kind of apprenticeship that meant you spent 10 years of your life learning how to do one thing so perfectly that it kept an entire community alive. And if you messed up, well, people died. No pressure. Brother Thomas had learned his craft from Brother Aldrich, who had learned it from Brother Matthias, who had learned it from a woman named Elspeth who wasn't a nun but who the monastery had quietly sheltered during the persecutions of 1298 because she knew things. Things about plants and water and fire and preservation that the church both needed and feared in equal measure. The first technique Brother Thomas had learned, at the tender age of 14, was something so simple, so elegant, that when he first heard it, he thought Brother Aldrich was pulling his leg. How to find water when there is no water. Not with a stick. Not with prayer, though that helped. But with observation, with patience, with understanding that the earth itself will tell you where the water hides if you just know how to listen. It was early spring, and the monastery's main well had collapsed. Just fallen in on itself. Probably because some apprentice stonemason 50 years ago had cut corners nobody knew about until gravity decided to have its say. The backup well was producing maybe a bucket an hour, nowhere near enough for 40 monks, 12 novices, and the 100 or so villagers who depended on the monastery for, well, everything. Brother Aldrich had taken young Thomas by the shoulder and led him outside before dawn. The old monk didn't speak much, which was fine because he'd taken a vow of relative silence anyway. He pointed at the ground, still dark in the pre-dawn gloom, and made Thomas watch. Just watch. As the sun came up, something magical happened. And I don't mean magical in the supernatural sense. I mean magical in the way that science is magical when you understand it, when you see the universe showing you its secrets. Certain patches of ground, seemingly random patches, stayed darker longer. The dew there was thicker, beaded up in ways it didn't elsewhere. And in those patches, specific plants grew. Not the dramatic ones, not the flowers or the impressive weeds. No, the subtle ones. Tiny sorrel, wild mint, certain mosses that you'd walk right past without noticing. Brother Aldrich knelt down, his old knees cracking, and dug. Not deep, maybe 2 feet. And there it was, damp soil. In the middle of a drought, damp soil. He moved to another patch, this one about 30 feet away, where the same plants grew in the same pattern, and dug again. More damp soil. Then he did something that seemed insane. He started digging a trench between the 2 spots, following a line that only he could see. Thomas helped, because that's what novices did. They dug when they were told to dig. 3 feet down, the soil changed color. 4 feet down, it was mud. 5 feet down, water began to pool. Not rushing, not springing forth like in the stories. Just accumulating. Slow, steady, reliable. By the next morning, they had enough water for the entire monastery. Not from finding a new source, but from following the map that nature had written in plants and dew and soil color. From understanding that water moves underground in channels and rivers just like it does above ground, and if you know what to look for, you can trace those hidden rivers without ever seeing them. This is the kind of knowledge that kept people alive. This is the kind of knowledge we've completely forgotten. But water was just the beginning. Brother Thomas learned dozens of techniques that spring and summer, each one more fascinating than the last. And before we go further, if you're enjoying this journey into the forgotten wisdom of our ancestors, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button. These stories take weeks of research to put together, and your subscription tells me you want more of these deep dives into the techniques that kept humanity alive when the world was a much, much harder place. And hey, drop a comment and let me know what other forgotten techniques you want to hear about. Now, back to 1347 and the education of Brother Thomas. June brought the lesson of the hunger gap. You know what the hunger gap is? Most modern folks don't, because we've got grocery stores and supply chains and refrigeration. But in medieval times, the hunger gap was that period between when your stored food from last harvest ran out and when your new crops came in. Usually hit around May or June, and it killed more people than most wars did. Brother Aldrich took Thomas into the forest on the feast day of Saint Barnabas. The other monks thought they were going to pray in solitude, but Aldrich had other plans. He carried a basket and a knife, and Thomas carried confusion and curiosity in equal measure. The forest in June is abundant if you know what you're looking at. Aldrich pointed out plants that Thomas had walked past 1,000 times. Young nettle leaves, which had to be harvested before they flowered or they'd tear up your insides. Wild garlic, which grew in sheets under the oak trees. Dandelion greens, every part edible, every part nutritious. The inner bark of certain trees, pine and birch especially, which could be dried and ground into flour. Not great flour, not the kind you'd want to use if you had literally any other option, but flour that would keep you alive when the alternative was starvation. But here's where it got interesting. Aldrich didn't just show Thomas what to harvest. He showed him how to prepare it, how to preserve it, how to transform plants that would make you sick if you ate them raw into foods that could sustain you through the winter. Take acorns, for example. You've got oak trees all over the place, right? Acorns everywhere in the fall. But you can't just eat them. They're full of tannins that'll give you a wicked bellyache and potentially shut down your kidneys if you eat enough of them. So most modern people look at acorns and think, well, those are for squirrels. Medieval peasants knew better. They knew that if you shell the acorns, crush them into a coarse meal, and then run cold water through them for days, maybe a week, the tannins leach out. What you're left with is a nutritious, calorie-dense flour that you can mix with other flours or use on its own. Labor-intensive? Absolutely. But when the alternative is starvation, you make the time. Brother Aldrich had Thomas practice the process, using a basket woven so tightly it would hold the crushed acorn meal but let water pass through. Thomas would place the basket in a stream, weighted down with rocks, and let the water flow through it for 6 days, changing the position occasionally to ensure even leaching. By the 7th day, the acorn meal was ready, and they made a flatbread from it that tasted, honestly, pretty good. Nutty, dense, filling. This was survival knowledge. This was the kind of thing that meant the difference between a village making it through a bad year and a village becoming a ghost town. But the real test of Thomas's education came in August, when Brother Aldrich taught him about fire. Not how to make it. That was basic knowledge that even children had. No, Brother Aldrich taught Thomas about the different kinds of fire, about fire management, about techniques that could save your life or end it depending on how well you understood the principles. They stood in a clearing, and Aldrich built 3 fires. Not 1, 3. Each one with a different purpose, a different structure, a different personality if you will. The first fire was small, built in a shallow pit lined with stones. The wood was arranged in a precise pattern, almost like a tiny log cabin, with plenty of air space. This was a cooking fire, designed to produce even heat for a long time without constant tending. You could put a pot over this fire in the morning, add your ingredients, and come back 8 hours later to a perfectly cooked stew. The structure ensured that as wood burned down, more wood would fall into the optimal position automatically. Self-sustaining, efficient, reliable. The second fire was broader, built on flat stones arranged in a specific pattern. This was a heating fire, designed to warm a space or a group of people. But here's the clever part. Aldrich showed Thomas how to heat the stones for hours with a large fire, then remove most of the burning wood and cover the hot stones with a thin layer of ash. The stones would radiate heat for the entire night, staying warm enough to keep you from freezing but not so hot that you'd burn yourself if you accidentally rolled onto them while sleeping. And because the fire itself was mostly smothered, it wouldn't consume all the oxygen in a closed space. People who didn't know this technique would keep a fire burning all night in their shelter and never wake up, killed by carbon monoxide without ever knowing what hit them. The third fire, though, was special. This one was built in a deep hole, almost 3 feet down, and the wood was arranged vertically, not horizontally. Aldrich called it a Dakota fire hole, though Thomas didn't know what Dakota meant and Aldrich wasn't telling. This fire was nearly invisible from more than 20 feet away, produced almost no smoke, and was perfect for situations where you needed heat and light but couldn't afford to advertise your presence. Times of war, times of persecution, times when being seen meant being killed. But the most important thing Aldrich taught Thomas about fire wasn't about building it. It was about preserving it. Because in medieval times, especially in winter, making fire from scratch was difficult, time-consuming, and uncertain. So you didn't let your fire go out if you could help it. You kept it alive, sometimes for years, passing it from generation to generation. Aldrich showed Thomas the fire log technique. You take a thick log, hardwood preferably, and you char one end of it in your fire. Then you pull it out and let it cool. The charred end will smolder for hours, sometimes days, if you manage it right. You can transport this log, you can keep it in your home, and when you need fire, you just blow on the charred end until it glows bright. Add some tinder and boom, you've got flame. Some families had fire logs that had been kept smoldering for generations, literally passed from mother to daughter for 100 years or more. This was survival knowledge. This was the wisdom that kept people alive in a world without matches, without lighters, without the convenience we take for granted. And if you're thinking, man, this is fascinating, I need to hear more of these stories, then you're in luck. Hit that like button, leave a comment telling me what historical period you want to explore next, and make sure you're subscribed to Dreamless Timelines because we're just getting started. We've got hours of forgotten techniques to explore, and trust me, it only gets more interesting from here. September came, and with it, the harvest. But Brother Aldrich wasn't interested in teaching Thomas about harvesting grain. Any fool could swing a scythe. No, Aldrich was interested in teaching Thomas about preservation, about taking the abundance of September and making it last until the following September if necessary. The monastery had a room, a special room that only a few brothers were allowed to enter. It was underground, accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen, and it maintained a constant temperature year-round. Not cold, exactly, but cool. Maybe 55 degrees Fahrenheit, though they didn't measure in Fahrenheit back then. They just knew that certain roots would keep there, certain vegetables would last months longer than they would anywhere else. But it wasn't just the temperature that mattered. It was the humidity, the air circulation, the way the food was arranged. Aldrich taught Thomas to store root vegetables in sand, layering them so they didn't touch each other, so air could circulate, so any rot that started in one wouldn't spread to the others. Turnips at the bottom because they lasted longest. Carrots above them. Beets carefully separated because they were finicky and would rot if you looked at them wrong. Apples were stored wrapped in cloth, each one individually, arranged in wooden crates with straw between the layers. But not just any apples. You had to inspect each one, and any apple with even the smallest bruise or blemish got eaten immediately or turned into preserves because it wouldn't last a week in storage, let alone months. Cabbage was hung from the ceiling by their roots, upside down, in the coolest part of the storage room. They'd keep for 4 months this way, maybe longer if you were lucky. But here's where it gets really interesting. Aldrich showed Thomas how to make a clamp, which is not what it sounds like. A clamp was a method of storing root vegetables outside, in the ground, even through the winter. You'd dig a shallow depression, line it with straw, pile your vegetables in a pyramid, cover them with more straw, and then cover the whole thing with soil. The earth and straw would insulate the vegetables, keeping them from freezing but also keeping them cool enough that they wouldn't sprout or rot. And because they were buried, animals couldn't get to them. The trick was making sure water couldn't get in. You had to dig a small trench around the clamp to direct water away, and you had to compact the soil on top just right so rain would run off instead of seeping in. Get it wrong, and you'd come back in January to find your vegetables had turned into a frozen, rotted mess. Get it right, and you'd have fresh food all winter. This knowledge, this understanding of temperature and humidity and airflow and preservation, this was the difference between feast and famine. This was science, practical science, developed over generations through trial and error and careful observation. October brought the slaughter season. Animals that couldn't be fed through the winter were killed, and their meat had to be preserved. Brother Thomas learned about salting, about smoking, about the precise balance required to keep meat edible for months without refrigeration. The salting room was separate from the main storage cellar, and for good reason. Salt was expensive, valuable enough that the monastery's supply was kept under lock and key. But Aldrich taught Thomas that you didn't need as much salt as most people thought, not if you used it correctly. The key was dry salt curing versus brine curing, and knowing when to use which method. Large cuts of meat, hams and shoulders and such, these were dry cured. You'd rub them all over with salt, really work it into the meat, and then you'd pack them in more salt in a wooden barrel. The salt would draw out moisture, which would drip out through holes in the bottom of the barrel. You had to drain this liquid off regularly, and you had to repack the meat with fresh salt every few days for the first couple of weeks. After about a month, the meat was cured, but it was also salty as hell and hard as wood. So you'd soak it in water for a day or two before cooking to draw out the excess salt, and then you'd have meat that was not only edible but actually pretty tasty. Smaller cuts, or meat you wanted to use sooner, these went into brine. Aldrich had a recipe that he'd learned from Brother Matthias, who'd learned it from Elspeth, who'd learned it from God knows where. Water, salt, honey, juniper berries, bay leaves, black pepper if you could afford it, all boiled together and then cooled. You'd submerge your meat in this brine in a sealed crock, and it would keep for months. The honey did something to the preservation process, made the meat less likely to spoil, though nobody understood why. They just knew it worked. But the real art was in smoking. The smokehouse at St. Edmunds was a small stone building with a fire pit at one end and racks for hanging meat at the other. The trick was to keep the fire low and slow, producing smoke but not much heat. Too much heat and you'd cook the meat instead of smoking it. Too little smoke and the meat wouldn't be properly preserved. Aldrich taught Thomas about different woods and what they did to the flavor and preservation qualities of the meat. Oak was traditional, reliable, gave a good strong smoke. Applewood was sweeter, better for pork. Hickory was intense, almost too much for some meats. And you never ever used pine or any resinous wood because it would make the meat taste like turpentine and possibly poison whoever ate it. The meat would hang in the smokehouse for weeks, sometimes months, slowly drying and absorbing the smoke. When it came out, it was dark, hard, and would last for a year or more if stored properly. You could take a piece of this smoked meat on a journey, carry it in your pack for months, and it would still be perfectly safe to eat. This was the knowledge that allowed people to survive in a world without refrigeration, without canning, without any of the preservation methods we take for granted today. November was when Brother Thomas learned about medicine, or what passed for medicine in 1347. And before you dismiss medieval medicine as superstition and bloodletting, understand that these people knew things about plants and healing that we're only now rediscovering with modern science. Brother Aldrich took Thomas to the Physic Garden, a carefully tended plot behind the monastery where medicinal herbs were grown. This wasn't the kitchen garden with its vegetables and cooking herbs. This was different, more serious, more dangerous in some ways. Willow bark, which they would strip and dry and make into a tea for pain and fever. We know now that willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. They didn't know that in 1347, but they knew willow bark tea worked, and they knew how much to give and who shouldn't take it. Foxglove, beautiful and deadly, which in very precise doses could help a failing heart. Too much and it would kill you stone dead. Brother Aldrich taught Thomas to recognize every stage of the foxglove plant, to harvest only the second-year leaves at just the right time, to prepare them in exactly the right way. This was knowledge that could save a life or end one, depending on the skill of the practitioner. Comfrey, which they called knit bone, because poultices made from comfrey root would help broken bones heal faster. Modern science has confirmed this, has identified compounds in comfrey that promote bone and tissue growth. But in 1347, they just knew it worked. Knew it from generations of observation and careful record-keeping. St. John's wort, for what they called melancholy and we would call depression. Harvested at midsummer, dried in the shade, made into a tea or tincture. Again, modern science has confirmed that St. John's wort has legitimate antidepressant properties. But the monks of St. Edmund's didn't need modern science. They had centuries of empirical evidence. Aldrich taught Thomas about wound care, about the importance of cleanliness even though they didn't understand germ theory. They knew that wounds washed with boiled water and dressed with clean cloths healed better than wounds that weren't. They knew that honey applied to a wound would prevent infection, though they didn't know about honey's antibacterial properties. They just knew it worked. They knew about maggot therapy, though they didn't call it that. They knew that if a wound became infected and gangrenous, sometimes allowing certain types of fly larvae to clean the wound would save a limb or a life. Disgusting? Absolutely. Effective. Modern medicine has proven that yes, medical-grade maggots are incredibly effective at cleaning necrotic tissue from wounds. This was practical medicine, empirical medicine, medicine based on observation and results rather than theory. And it worked far more often than it failed. December brought lessons in winter survival, in staying alive when everything outside wanted to kill you. And Brother Aldrich's lessons became more urgent, more serious, because winter in medieval England was no joke. The monastery began preparations in early December, before the first serious snow. Every crack in every window was sealed with a mixture of moss and clay. Every door was checked for drafts and gaps were stuffed with wool. Firewood was stacked not just in the wood store but in every room, because if you had to go outside to get firewood in a blizzard, you might not make it back. But Aldrich taught Thomas about personal survival, about what to do if you were caught outside in winter weather. How to recognize the signs of frostbite before it became serious. How to rewarm frozen extremities slowly, gradually, because warming them too quickly could cause more damage than the freezing itself. He taught Thomas about snow shelters, about how snow is actually an excellent insulator if you know how to use it. You could dig into a snowdrift, create a small chamber, and the snow itself would protect you from the wind and trap your body heat. People had survived nights in snow shelters that would have killed them if they tried to tough it out in the open. But you had to know the tricks. You needed a small air hole for ventilation, but not so big that you'd lose all your heat. You needed to make sure the roof of your shelter was thick enough that it wouldn't collapse on you, but not so thick that you couldn't dig out in the morning. You needed to insulate yourself from the ground with branches or grass or anything that would create an air gap, because the ground would suck the heat right out of your body if you laid on it directly. Aldrich taught Thomas about layering clothing, about how wool would keep you warm even when wet, about how the key to staying warm wasn't one thick layer but multiple thin layers with air trapped between them. He taught him that you wanted to stay dry at all costs, because wet clothing in winter was a death sentence. Better to be cold and dry than warm and wet. He taught Thomas about eating in winter, about how your body needed more calories, more fat, to maintain its temperature in cold weather. This was why winter food in medieval times was so heavy, so rich. It wasn't just about taste, it was about survival. And then, one evening in mid-December, Brother Aldrich revealed something that Thomas had never known existed. A secret that the monastery had kept for nearly 100 years. Beneath the storage cellar, beneath the level where they kept the preserved food and the wine and the ale, there was another level. A level so secret that only the abbot and 2 trusted monks knew of its existence. And now Thomas, because Aldrich was getting old and someone needed to know. They descended through a hidden door, down rough stone steps that looked like they'd been carved by hand centuries ago. The air was cool but not cold, dry but not desiccated. And the room, when they reached it, was full of wonders. Seeds. Thousands upon thousands of seeds, each variety carefully stored in its own sealed container, labeled in a handwriting so old Thomas could barely read it. This was the monastery's insurance policy, their hedge against disaster. If a crop failed, if disease wiped out their grain, if catastrophe struck, they had backup seeds of every plant they'd ever grown, some varieties going back generations. But it wasn't just seeds. There were books, manuscripts carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, medical texts, agricultural treatises, records of techniques and methods that went back to Roman times, knowledge that had survived the fall of Rome, the Dark Ages, countless invasions and disasters. And there were samples, preserved specimens of plants that no longer grew in England, kept as references in case someone needed to identify them from a description in one of the old texts. Aldrich showed Thomas a dried flower, carefully pressed and preserved, of a plant that Brother Matthias had said could cure diseases they didn't even have names for. The plant didn't grow in England anymore, probably had never grown in England, but someone, sometime, had thought it important enough to preserve. This was more than just survival knowledge. This was the preservation of knowledge itself, the understanding that information could be as precious as food or water, and that some knowledge, once lost, might never be recovered. Aldrich made Thomas swear an oath, a serious oath, that he would protect this chamber, protect its contents, and pass the knowledge on when the time came. Thomas swore, not really understanding the weight of what he was promising, but he'd learn soon enough. By now you might be wondering where this story is going, and I promise you, we're building to something. Something that will make all of these techniques, all of this knowledge, absolutely crucial. But we're not there yet. We've got hours to go, and so many more techniques to learn. If you're enjoying this deep dive into forgotten medieval survival wisdom, do me a favor and drop a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there are specific techniques or time periods you want to hear about. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and join us on Dreamless Timelines as we explore the forgotten knowledge that kept humanity alive through the darkest times in history. January of 1348 arrived cold and bitter. The monks of St. Edmund's huddled in their cells, wrapped in wool and fur, tending their carefully managed fires. But Brother Aldrich's lessons didn't stop just because it was freezing outside. If anything, they became more intense. Aldrich taught Thomas about ice harvesting, about how you could cut blocks of ice from frozen ponds and store them in a specially built ice house where they'd last well into summer. The ice house was half buried, with thick walls filled with sawdust for insulation. You'd pack the ice blocks in layers of straw, and if you did it right, you'd have ice in July. But why? Why would you want ice in July? Because you could use it to preserve food, yes, but also because you could use it to reduce fevers, to ease pain, to provide comfort to the sick. Ice in summer was a luxury, but it was also medicine, and the monks of St. Edmund's made sure they had it. Aldrich taught Thomas about brewing ale, and before you think that's not a survival technique, understand that in medieval times, ale was safer to drink than water. The brewing process killed the pathogens that made water dangerous, and the alcohol further prevented contamination. A monastery without ale was a monastery with sick monks, simple as that. But brewing wasn't just throwing grain and water together and hoping for the best. It was a precise process that required knowledge and skill. The grain had to be malted, which meant soaking it until it sprouted, then drying it in a kiln. The sprouting converted the starches in the grain to sugars, which the yeast would then convert to alcohol. The temperature of the water mattered. Too hot and you'd kill the enzymes you needed. Too cold and the process wouldn't start. You needed it just right, and just right was something you learned to judge by feel, by experience, by hundreds of batches until you could tell just by looking at the steam rising off the water whether it was ready. The hops, which were relatively new to England in 1348, had to be added at just the right time and in just the right amount. Too many hops and the ale would be undrinkably bitter. Too few and it wouldn't keep as long. The hops weren't just for flavor, they were a preservative, an antibacterial agent that kept the ale from spoiling. And then there was the yeast, though they didn't call it yeast. They called it barm or alewife, and they treated it with a respect bordering on reverence. Some monasteries had yeast cultures that had been kept alive for generations, passed from one brewmaster to the next. You guarded your yeast like you guarded your fire, because without it, there was no ale, and without ale, there was sickness and death. This was survival knowledge dressed up as a craft, and it kept people alive just as surely as knowing how to find water or build a fire. February brought lessons in food security, in ensuring that you'd have enough to eat not just this year but next year and the year after that. Aldrich took Thomas through the monastery's entire food storage system, showing him not just where things were kept but why they were kept that way, and how to tell if something had gone bad. Grain was stored in sealed containers with certain herbs that repelled insects. Aldrich taught Thomas to inspect the grain regularly, to know the signs of weevil infestation before it became serious. A small infestation could be dealt with by spreading the grain out in the sun, which would drive the weevils to the surface where you could brush them off. A large infestation meant the grain was lost, and you'd have to fall back on your reserves. Cheese was stored carefully, each wheel inspected and turned regularly. You couldn't just cut a piece off and forget about the rest. The exposed surface had to be carefully maintained, wrapped in cloth soaked in brine or beer, to prevent unwanted mold from taking hold. Some mold was fine, even desirable. Other molds would ruin the cheese and potentially make you sick. Knowing the difference was crucial. Dried fish hung from the ceiling in one of the storage rooms, and they smelled absolutely terrible. But they'd keep for years if stored properly, and when soaked in water for a day or two before cooking, they were perfectly edible and nutritious. Not delicious, mind you, but edible. Aldrich showed Thomas the records, the careful accounting of every item in storage, when it had been put there, when it should be used by. This wasn't just bureaucracy, this was survival planning. You needed to know what you had, how long it would last, and what you needed to acquire before you ran out. And then Aldrich taught Thomas the most important lesson of all, redundancy. You never relied on one source of food, one method of preservation, one type of crop. You spread your bets, diversified, made sure that if one thing failed, you had backups. This was thinking that went beyond individual survival. This was thinking about community survival, about ensuring that the monastery and the people who depended on it would make it through whatever disasters might come. March arrived, and with it, the first hints of spring. The snow began to melt, the days grew longer, and Brother Aldrich's lessons shifted to focus on the growing season ahead. But before they could plant, they had to prepare the soil, and this was where Aldrich taught Thomas about composting, about crop rotation, about soil management techniques that wouldn't be officially discovered until centuries later. The monastery had several compost heaps, carefully managed piles of organic waste that were turned and watered and tended almost as carefully as the gardens themselves. Food scraps, animal waste, old straw, fallen leaves, everything went into the compost. But it wasn't just thrown in randomly. Aldrich taught Thomas about the ratio of green material to brown material, about how the pile needed to be built in layers to promote proper decomposition. Too much green material and the pile would become slimy and anaerobic and smell like death. Too much brown material and it would dry out and stop decomposing. You needed the balance just right. And you needed to turn the pile regularly, moving material from the outside to the inside and vice versa, ensuring even decomposition. A well-managed compost pile would actually heat up, sometimes hot enough that you couldn't hold your hand in the center for more than a second or two. This heat was a sign of active decomposition, and it also killed weed seeds and disease organisms. After 6 months to a year, depending on management, you'd have rich, dark, crumbly compost that would transform even the poorest soil into a productive garden bed. This was the monastery's secret weapon, the reason their gardens produced more food per square foot than the surrounding peasant farms. But Aldrich also taught Thomas about crop rotation, about not planting the same crop in the same place year after year. They didn't understand nitrogen fixing or nutrient depletion back then, but they understood through generations of observation that certain crops would exhaust the soil while others would replenish it. Beans and peas, they noticed, actually improved the soil. Plant beans in a field one year, and the next year, whatever you planted there would grow better. We know now that legumes fix nitrogen from the air into the soil, but in 1348, they just knew it worked. So they rotated crops in a 3-year cycle. Grain one year, which took a lot out of the soil. Beans or peas the next year, which put nutrients back. Fallow the 3rd year, meaning they planted nothing but let the field rest, often grazing animals on it so their manure would further enrich the soil. This system, developed over centuries of trial and error, kept the monastery's fields productive year after year, while other fields gradually became exhausted and useless. April was planting season, and Brother Thomas learned the techniques that would ensure a successful harvest. How deep to plant each seed, how far apart, how much water they needed. But more than that, he learned about companion planting, about how certain plants helped each other when grown together. Beans growing up corn stalks, which gave the beans support while the beans fixed nitrogen for the corn. Squash planted around the base of the corn, which shaded out weeds and kept the soil moist. The 3 sisters, they called this combination, and it was brilliant agricultural science developed by people who didn't know they were doing science. Onions planted among the carrots, which confused the carrot fly and reduced pest damage. Marigolds planted around the edge of the garden, which repelled certain insects. Herbs planted strategically throughout, which attracted beneficial insects and repelled harmful ones. This wasn't superstition, this was ecology, practical application of observations about how plants and insects and soil organisms interacted. And it worked. May brought the threat of late frosts, and Aldrich taught Thomas how to protect tender plants from unexpected cold snaps. They'd cover vulnerable plants with straw or cloth at night, creating a layer of insulation that could make the difference between a successful growing season and starvation the following winter. But the real lesson of May was about observation, about reading the signs that nature provided. Aldrich taught Thomas to watch the oak trees and the ash trees. There was an old saying, "Oak before ash, we're in for a splash. Ash before oak, we're in for a soak." Meaning if the oak trees leafed out before the ash trees, you'd have a dry summer. If the ash came first, expect a wet one. Simple folk wisdom, but it was based on generations of observation, and it was right more often than it was wrong. Thomas learned to watch the birds, to know what it meant when the swallows flew low or high, when the crows gathered in certain trees, when the robins started singing before dawn. Each sign meant something, told you something about the weather to come, the season ahead. He learned to read the clouds, to know the difference between clouds that meant rain in a few hours and clouds that meant rain in a few days. To recognize the sky that meant a storm was coming, the kind of storm where you'd better get everything secured and get yourself inside because nature was about to remind you who was really in charge. This was meteorology before anyone called it that. This was science built on observation and experience, passed down through generations, keeping people alive by letting them prepare for what was coming. June brought the first real heat of summer, and with it, new challenges. Aldrich taught Thomas about keeping food fresh in warm weather, about the techniques that would prevent spoilage when you couldn't just throw things in a refrigerator. The monastery had a spring house, a small building built over a natural spring where the water flowed constantly through channels carved in stone. They'd place crocks of milk and cheese in the water, and the constant flow of cold spring water would keep them fresh for days, sometimes weeks. The key was keeping the water moving, keeping it fresh, ensuring the temperature stayed constant. But not everyone had access to a spring. So Aldrich taught Thomas about evaporative cooling, about how you could keep things cool using nothing but water, cloth, and airflow. You'd wrap food in cloth, soak the cloth in water, and place it somewhere with good air circulation. As the water evaporated, it would draw heat away from the food, keeping it significantly cooler than the ambient temperature. This was the same principle that modern swamp coolers use, but these medieval monks figured it out through experimentation and observation, not through understanding thermodynamics. Aldrich also taught Thomas about the danger of spoiled food, about how to tell when something had gone bad and needed to be thrown out, no matter how hungry you were. Because food poisoning in medieval times wasn't just an unpleasant few days, it could kill you. They didn't understand bacteria, but they understood that certain smells, certain appearances, certain textures meant danger. If meat had a rainbow sheen on the surface, it was bad. If it smelled like ammonia or sulfur, it was bad. If milk curdled when it shouldn't, if cheese developed the wrong color of mold, if grain started to smell musty or look discolored, these were all signs of danger, and ignoring them could be fatal. This was practical food safety, developed over generations of trial and error, of people learning the hard way what was safe and what wasn't. July was the month when Brother Aldrich taught Thomas about textiles, about making and maintaining the clothing and fabrics that kept you warm in winter and protected you from the sun in summer. And this wasn't just about survival comfort, this was about actual survival, because in medieval times, exposure could kill you as surely as starvation. The monastery had a small flock of sheep, and Aldrich showed Thomas the entire process of turning wool into cloth. First, the shearing, which had to be done carefully so you didn't hurt the sheep but got as much wool as possible. The fleece came off in one piece if you did it right, a whole wool coat that you could then process. The wool had to be washed, and this wasn't just a quick rinse. You had to get all the lanolin out, all the dirt and debris that accumulated on a sheep that spent its life outdoors. They'd use a mixture of water and stale urine, because the ammonia in the urine would break down the lanolin. Disgusting to modern sensibilities, but incredibly effective. Then the wool had to be carded, combed with special brushes to align all the fibers in the same direction. This was tedious work, hours and hours of repetitive motion, but it was necessary to produce good yarn. Spinning the wool into yarn was an art form in itself. Too loose and the yarn would be weak and fall apart. Too tight and it would be stiff and difficult to work with. You needed it just right, and just right came from practice, from spinning so much yarn that your hands knew what to do without your brain having to think about it. The nuns at a nearby convent did most of the monastery's weaving, turning the yarn into cloth on massive looms. But Aldrich taught Thomas the basics, showed him how the warp and weft threads interlocked to create fabric, how different weaving patterns created different properties in the finished cloth. And then there was dyeing, and this is where things got really interesting. Aldrich took Thomas on another foraging expedition, this time looking for plants that would produce dyes. Woad for blue, madder for red, weld for yellow, onion skins for orange, walnut hulls for brown, certain lichens for purple. But it wasn't just about finding the right plants. You needed mordants, chemicals that would make the dye bind to the fabric permanently instead of just washing out the first time it got wet. Alum was the most common mordant, but it was expensive and had to be purchased from traveling merchants. So they also used wood ash lye, iron-rich water from certain springs, and other substances that they discovered through experimentation would fix dyes to fabric. The dyeing process itself was precise. The water had to be the right temperature, the fabric had to be prepared correctly, the dye bath had to be maintained for the right amount of time. Get it wrong and you'd end up with uneven color, or color that faded immediately, or fabric that was damaged by the dyeing process. But get it right, and you'd have clothing that would last for years, that would keep you warm and dry and protected. This was practical chemistry, developed and refined over centuries, keeping people alive by keeping them clothed. August brought lessons in hunting and fishing, in supplementing your diet with wild game and fish when your stored food was running low or you just needed variety to prevent malnutrition. Brother Aldrich, despite being a monk, was an excellent hunter. He'd learned the skill as a boy, before he took his vows, and the monastery valued the skill too much to let it go to waste. God provided the deer and the rabbits and the fish, Aldrich would say, and it would be ungrateful not to make use of his provisions. He taught Thomas about tracking, about reading the signs that animals left behind. A bent blade of grass here, a partial hoofprint there, droppings that told you not just what kind of animal had passed by but how long ago. Fresh droppings were moist and steamed in cold weather. Old droppings were dry and crumbly. The difference told you whether you were tracking something from an hour ago or 3 days ago. Aldrich taught Thomas about snares, simple traps made from cord that would catch rabbits and other small game. The key was placing them in the right locations, in the runs that rabbits used regularly, at the right height, with the loop the right size. Too small and the rabbit would just push through. Too large and it would pass through without being caught. He taught Thomas about fishing, about reading the water to know where fish would be. In summer, fish would be in the shade, under overhanging banks, near underwater structures that provided shelter from the current. In winter, they'd be in the deeper pools where the water was slightly warmer. Different fish required different techniques. Trout were wary and smart, requiring stealth and careful presentation of your bait. Pike were aggressive predators that would strike at almost anything that moved. Eels could be caught in wicker traps baited with scraps of meat. But Aldrich also taught Thomas about conservation, about not taking more than you needed, about letting some fish go so they could reproduce and ensure there would be fish for next year and the year after that. This was sustainability before the word existed, practical resource management developed out of necessity. And here's something that might blow your mind. These medieval monks understood the life cycle of fish better than many people do today. They knew that salmon would swim upstream to spawn and die, that eels would migrate to the sea. They knew when fish were spawning and avoided fishing during those times. They knew about seasonal patterns, about when fish were most active and when they were sluggish. This was ecology, practical application of observed natural patterns, keeping people fed without depleting the resources they depended on. September came around again, and Brother Thomas had been studying under Brother Aldrich for a full year. He'd learned so much, absorbed so many techniques, that his head sometimes felt like it would burst with all the information. But Aldrich wasn't done. Not even close. This September, Aldrich taught Thomas about tool making and maintenance, about the implements that made all the other survival techniques possible. Because you couldn't preserve food without knives, couldn't build a fire without an axe, couldn't farm without plows and hoes. The monastery had a forge, and the blacksmith, Brother Edmund, worked with Aldrich to teach Thomas the basics of metalworking. Not enough to make him a blacksmith, that would take years of dedicated apprenticeship, but enough that he could maintain tools, sharpen blades, make simple repairs. Aldrich taught Thomas about different types of metal and what they were good for. Iron was strong but would rust if not cared for. Steel was harder and held an edge better but was more difficult to work with. Bronze was easier to cast but wasn't as strong as iron. He taught Thomas about tempering, about how you could harden steel by heating it until it glowed and then quenching it in water or oil, but that hardened steel was brittle and would break under stress. So you had to temper it, heat it again to a lower temperature and cool it slowly, which would make it tougher and less likely to shatter. This was metallurgy, Practical knowledge of how metals behaved under different conditions developed over millennia of trial and error. But more important than making tools was maintaining them. Aldrich showed Thomas how to properly sharpen a knife, maintaining the correct angle on the edge, using progressively finer stones until the blade was sharp enough to shave with. A dull knife wasn't just inefficient, it was dangerous, more likely to slip and cut you than a sharp knife that would do exactly what you intended. He showed Thomas how to oil metal tools to prevent rust, how to store them properly so they wouldn't get damaged, how to inspect them regularly for wear or damage that could cause them to fail at a critical moment. And he taught Thomas about improvisation, about making tools from natural materials when metal wasn't available. A digging stick hardened in fire could work almost as well as a metal spade for certain tasks. A flint flake could serve as a knife in a pinch. Bone could be shaped into needles, hooks, handles. This was the knowledge that allowed people to survive even when they didn't have access to blacksmiths or metal goods, the knowledge that kept humanity alive before we even had metal tools. October, and the days were getting shorter again. Brother Aldrich's lessons took on a more urgent tone because he was getting older, and he knew his time was limited. He needed to pass on everything he knew, and there was still so much Thomas hadn't learned. Aldrich taught Thomas about navigation, about finding your way when you were lost, when there were no roads or signs to guide you. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west, everyone knew that. But Aldrich taught Thomas the subtleties, about how the sun's path across the sky changed with the seasons, how you could use it to tell not just direction but time of day. He taught Thomas about using stars for navigation, about how certain constellations never moved relative to the North Star, and how you could use them to orient yourself on a clear night. The Big Dipper pointed to the North Star. Orion's belt pointed east to west. Cassiopeia was visible year-round in England and could help you find north even when the Big Dipper was below the horizon. But what if it was cloudy? What if you couldn't see the sun or stars? Aldrich taught Thomas about reading the landscape, about how trees grew differently on the north side than the south side, how moss tended to grow more thickly on the north side of trees, how you could tell which direction water flowed and follow it to larger streams and rivers that would eventually lead to civilization. He taught Thomas about marking your trail, about bending branches or stacking stones in ways that would guide you back if you needed to retrace your steps. Simple techniques that could save your life if you got turned around in unfamiliar forest. And speaking of forests, if you're lost in this story, don't worry. We're building to something huge, something that will tie all of these techniques together and show you why Brother Thomas needed to learn all of this. But we're not there yet. We've got so much more ground to cover, so many more techniques to explore. And if you're enjoying this journey, if you're learning things you never knew about how our ancestors survived, then show some love. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to Dreamless Timelines because we're just hitting our stride. Hours more of forgotten wisdom to come, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. November arrived, cold and dark, and Brother Aldrich began teaching Thomas about shelter construction, about creating protection from the elements when you didn't have the luxury of a monastery to retreat to. They went into the forest, and Aldrich showed Thomas how to build a proper shelter using nothing but materials you could find in the woods. Not a crude lean-to that would barely keep the rain off, but a real shelter that could keep you alive through a winter storm. The key was location. You didn't build your shelter in a valley bottom where cold air would pool and frost would be heaviest. You didn't build it on a hilltop where wind would buffet you all night. You built it on a slight rise, with natural wind protection from trees or terrain features, near a water source but not so close that you'd be in danger if the stream flooded. The framework was made from saplings, flexible enough to bend but strong enough to support weight. Aldrich showed Thomas how to lash them together using cordage made from plant fibers or strips of bark. The lashings had to be tight, secure, because your life might depend on the structure not collapsing in high wind or under the weight of snow. The covering was layers of bark, leaves, and grass, arranged in an overlapping pattern like shingles on a roof. Water would run off the outside layers without penetrating to the inside. The thicker the layers, the better the insulation, the warmer and drier you'd stay. Inside, you'd build a raised bed platform using branches and more leaves, creating an air gap between you and the cold ground. Remember what I said before about the ground sucking heat from your body? This solved that problem. And if you had time, you'd build a small fire pit just outside the shelter entrance, with a rock reflector behind it to direct heat into the shelter. Not a big fire, you didn't need much, just enough to warm the air inside and dry out any moisture. Aldrich had Thomas build one of these shelters from scratch, which took the better part of 2 days. And then Aldrich made him spend a night in it, in November, with temperatures dropping below freezing. Thomas thought he'd freeze to death, but the shelter worked. He woke up the next morning cold but alive, and he'd learned a technique that could save his life if he ever needed it. December brought lessons in weather prediction, in reading the signs that would tell you what was coming in the next few hours, the next few days. Because in medieval times, you couldn't just check an app on your phone. You had to know how to read the natural world. A ring around the moon meant rain within a day or two. Red sky at night meant good weather tomorrow. Red sky in the morning meant a storm was coming. These weren't superstitions, they were based on atmospheric optics and pressure patterns. They just didn't know the science behind why they worked. Aldrich taught Thomas about using natural barometers, about how certain flowers would close before rain, how cows would lie down before a storm, how fish would stop biting when the pressure dropped. Each species reacting to changes in air pressure or humidity that humans couldn't detect directly, but that we could observe if we paid attention. He taught Thomas about reading the wind, about how wind direction and speed told you what weather systems were approaching. Wind from the east meant a storm. Wind from the west meant clearing. Strong, gusty wind meant the weather was unstable and could change quickly. And he taught Thomas about the smell of the air, about how you could sometimes smell rain coming, especially in summer. The petrichor, though they didn't call it that, the earthy smell that came when rain was imminent. We know now it's caused by oils from plants and bacteria being released into the air, but in 1348, they just knew that when you smelled it, you'd better seek shelter because rain was coming soon. This was practical meteorology, the kind that kept farmers from losing crops to unexpected storms, that kept travelers from being caught out in dangerous weather, that kept people alive by giving them time to prepare. January 1349 arrived, and Brother Aldrich's health was failing. He could no longer walk the long distances he used to, could no longer spend hours in the cold teaching Thomas outdoor skills. But his mind was sharp, and he had more to teach. They spent long hours in Aldrich's cell, the old monk wrapped in blankets against the cold, and he taught Thomas about record keeping, about the importance of writing things down. The monastery kept detailed records of everything: weather patterns, crop yields, which preservation techniques worked best for which foods, what medicines helped which illnesses. This wasn't just bureaucracy, this was the accumulation of knowledge, the building of a database that future generations could reference and build on. Aldrich showed Thomas records going back 100 years. Notations about harsh winters and mild winters, about droughts and floods. Patterns emerged when you looked at decades of data. Cycles became apparent. And this allowed planning, allowed preparation in ways that weren't possible if you only remembered the last few years. He showed Thomas medical records, careful descriptions of diseases and their symptoms, what treatments had been tried, what had worked. Crude by modern standards, but it was the scientific method in practice, systematic observation and recording of results. And Aldrich made Thomas promise that he would continue this record keeping, that he would add his own observations and experiences to the collective knowledge. Because this was how humanity progressed, not through individual genius but through the accumulated wisdom of generations. February 1349, and rumors began to reach the monastery. Disturbing rumors. Stories from travelers, from merchants, from priests at other monasteries. A disease spreading across Europe, killing everyone it touched. Cities emptied, whole villages wiped out. The pestilence, they called it. The Great Mortality. Brother Aldrich heard these rumors, and he knew what was coming. He'd heard stories from the old monks, stories passed down from their teachers, about plagues that had swept through Europe centuries before. And he understood that everything he'd taught Thomas, all the survival techniques, all the preservation methods, all the knowledge about medicine and food and water, all of it was about to be tested. He called Thomas to his cell one final time, and his voice was weak but urgent. "Everything I've taught you," he said, "every technique, every method, every secret, they're going to matter now. They're going to matter more than they ever have." He made Thomas go through it all, reciting back everything he'd learned. How to find water, how to preserve food, how to make fire, how to brew safe ale, how to prepare medicine, how to build shelter, how to navigate, how to track, how to fish and hunt, how to spin wool and dye cloth, how to sharpen tools, how to read weather, how to keep records. Every technique, every method, all of it connected, all of it part of a comprehensive system of survival knowledge that had been refined over generations. "The pestilence is coming," Aldrich said, "and when it comes, many will die. But those who remember, those who know how to survive, who know how to keep themselves clean, how to keep their water pure, how to preserve food, how to maintain their strength, they have a chance. A small chance, but a chance." He gripped Thomas's hand with surprising strength. "You must remember. You must survive. And you must teach others. The knowledge cannot die. Do you understand?" Thomas understood. And 3 days later, Brother Aldrich died, peacefully in his sleep, before the pestilence ever reached the monastery. It was a mercy, in a way. But now Thomas was alone, the sole keeper of secrets that might be the only thing standing between his community and total annihilation. March 1349, and the pestilence arrived. A merchant came to the monastery gates, seeking shelter. He looked healthy enough, just tired from travel. The monks took him in, fed him, gave him a place to sleep. That was their duty, their calling. 2 days later, he was dead, his body covered in black swellings, his skin bruised and discolored. And the day after that, 3 monks fell ill with the same symptoms. The Black Death had arrived at St. Edmund's. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is supposed to be a story about survival techniques, not a horror story about the plague. But stick with me, because this is where everything we've been learning comes together. This is where all of Brother Thomas's knowledge, all the techniques Brother Aldrich taught him, all of it gets put to the ultimate test. And if you want to find out how this story ends, if you want to learn the specific techniques that helped some people survive one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, then you need to stay with me. Hit that like button, leave a comment telling me you're still here, and for the love of God, subscribe to Dreamless Timelines because this story is about to get intense, and you do not want to miss what happens next. Brother Thomas stood in the chapter house, facing the surviving monks. Of the 40 who had been there when the merchant arrived, 23 remained. 17 dead in 3 weeks. And more were showing symptoms. The abbot was among the dead. The prior was among the dead. Brother Edmund the blacksmith was among the dead. Thomas, at 24 years old, barely more than a boy, was now the senior monk in terms of survival knowledge. He remembered everything Brother Aldrich had taught him, and he started implementing it systematically, methodically, turning the monastery into a fortress against disease. First, water. The communal wells where everyone drew water, those were potentially contaminated. Thomas ordered them sealed. Instead, he had the monks dig new wells, upslope from any potential source of contamination, using the techniques Aldrich had taught him for finding underground water sources. He made sure every drop of water used for drinking was first boiled, even though they didn't understand germ theory. Aldrich had taught him that boiled water was safer, and Thomas trusted that knowledge. Second, soap. Remember at the beginning of this story, I mentioned Brother Thomas with his hands stained black from making soap? This was when it mattered. He set up a soap-making operation, rendering animal fat from the monastery's livestock, mixing it with lye made from wood ash, adding the crushed oak bark that Aldrich had said made the soap more effective. He made the monks wash their hands constantly before eating, after touching anything that might be contaminated, after dealing with the sick. He made them wash their faces, their arms. He made them bathe, completely, at least once a week, using the soap. This was radical. Most people bathed maybe once a month, if that. But Thomas insisted, and because people were dying all around them, they listened. The students learned about food preservation, and this was crucial knowledge in the post-plague world. With fewer people to harvest crops, with fewer mouths to feed but also fewer hands to do the work, it was more important than ever to make sure nothing was wasted. Thomas taught them the salting techniques, the smoking methods, the proper ways to store grain and vegetables. He taught them about the root cellars and clamps, about how to preserve apples and cabbage through the winter. He taught them about making cheese and butter, about brewing ale and mead, about fermentation and its role in preservation. But he also taught them something Brother Aldrich had only hinted at, the importance of variety. You couldn't survive on just one preserved food, no matter how much of it you had. Your body needed different nutrients, different vitamins and minerals that came from different sources. Eat nothing but salted pork for months and you develop scurvy, your teeth would fall out, your wounds wouldn't heal. Eat nothing but bread and you develop pellagra, your skin would crack and bleed, your mind would go foggy. So Thomas taught them about balanced nutrition, about making sure they ate vegetables and fruits, grains and proteins, dairy and fats. He didn't understand nutrition in the modern sense, but he understood through observation and passed down knowledge that variety in diet led to health and lack of variety led to disease. One of the male students, a boy named John who'd lost his entire family in the second wave of plague, became fascinated with herbal medicine. Thomas taught him everything he knew about the physic garden, about the properties of different plants, about preparation methods and dosages. John proved to have a gift for it. He could remember hundreds of plants, their uses, their dangers. He could prepare medicines with precision, measuring by eye and feel with an accuracy that rivaled monks who'd been doing it for decades. Thomas recognized that John had found his calling, and he nurtured that gift, teaching him everything Brother Aldrich had taught him and then some. By 1352, 3 years after the worst of the plague had passed, the school at St. Edmund's had 30 students. And those students were going out into the world, carrying the knowledge with them, teaching others, spreading the techniques that could mean the difference between survival and death. But Thomas knew there was more to teach, techniques that went beyond the basics, advanced survival knowledge that required years of practice to master. And for his most advanced students, he began teaching these deeper secrets. One of these techniques was weather modification. Not in the sense of actually controlling the weather, that was impossible. But in the sense of working with the weather, of understanding it so deeply that you could minimize its negative effects and maximize its benefits. Thomas taught his students about microclimates, about how certain spots in a field would be warmer or cooler, wetter or drier, based on subtle variations in terrain and vegetation. Plant your tender crops in the warm spots, your cold hardy crops in the cool spots. Use the natural variations to extend your growing season, to increase your yields. He taught them about creating windbreaks, planting hedgerows and trees in patterns that would protect fields from harsh winds without creating too much shade. The windbreaks would reduce water evaporation, prevent soil erosion, and create sheltered microclimates where more delicate plants could thrive. He taught them about water management, about creating small dams and channels that would direct rainwater where you wanted it to go, that would prevent flooding in some areas while providing irrigation in others. Not grand engineering projects, but small-scale interventions that worked with the natural flow of water rather than trying to fight against it. Margaret, the girl who had such a talent for finding water, became Thomas's expert in water management. She designed systems for the monastery and surrounding farms that caught rainwater, stored it in ponds and cisterns, and distributed it through channels to where it was needed. Her systems were so effective that farms using them could produce crops even in dry years that would have been disasters without her innovations. Thomas also taught advanced preservation techniques, methods that went beyond simple salting and smoking. He taught his students about creating preserves and conserves, cooking fruits with honey or the limited amounts of sugar they could acquire, creating foods that would last for years if sealed properly. He taught them about pickling, about how certain vegetables could be preserved in brine or vinegar, creating foods that were not only preserved but actually gained nutritional value through the fermentation process. We know now that fermented foods contain probiotics, beneficial bacteria that aid digestion and boost the immune system. They didn't know that in 1352, but they knew that people who ate pickled vegetables regularly seemed to be healthier than those who didn't. John, the student with the gift for herbal medicine, developed a technique for preserving herbs that was more effective than simple drying. He would pack fresh herbs in salt, creating layers in a crock, and the salt would draw out the moisture while preserving the herbs' medicinal properties far better than air drying. When he needed the herbs, he'd brush off the salt, crush the herbs, and use them just as effectively as if they'd been fresh. The years passed, and the school at St. Edmund's became famous throughout East Anglia. People would travel for days to study there, to learn the survival techniques that had kept the monastery and its associated villages alive when so many others had perished. And Thomas, now in his 30s, began to think about the long-term survival of the knowledge itself. Because he understood that techniques could be lost, that if they weren't written down, weren't preserved systematically, they could disappear in a single generation. He remembered the secret chamber beneath the monastery, the one Brother Aldrich had shown him years ago. And he decided it was time to expand it, to create a true library of survival knowledge. He selected his most trusted students, Margaret and John among them, and he revealed the chamber to them. Their eyes widened as they saw the carefully preserved seeds, the ancient manuscripts, the dried plant specimens that dated back generations. "This is our most important work," Thomas told them. "More important than any individual life, including mine. This knowledge must survive. It must be passed on. It must never be lost." Together, they began a project that would take years to complete. They would document every technique, every method, every observation. Not in the flowery language of formal manuscripts, but in clear, practical terms that anyone could understand and follow. They created illustrated guides to plant identification, with pressed specimens mounted next to detailed drawings and descriptions. They created step-by-step instructions for preservation methods, for building shelters, for finding water, for making tools. They created comprehensive records of medicinal plants, including dosages, preparation methods, and warnings about potential dangers. They documented every plant in the physic garden, every technique they developed for treating illness and injury. And they created manuals for agriculture, for animal husbandry, for all the crafts and skills that kept a community alive. Metalworking, woodworking, textile production, pottery, thatching, everything. This was more than just record keeping. This was the creation of an encyclopedia of survival, a comprehensive guide to staying alive in a dangerous world. But Thomas knew that written records weren't enough. Knowledge had to be practiced, had to be passed from teacher to student through hands-on experience. So he created a formal apprenticeship system, pairing each master craftsperson with multiple apprentices, ensuring that skills were taught thoroughly before the masters died. And people were dying, still. Not from plague, that had passed, but from age, from accidents, from the normal hazards of medieval life. Every death was a potential loss of knowledge, and Thomas was determined to prevent that loss whenever possible. One of the most important techniques Thomas taught his advanced students was something Brother Aldrich had only touched on briefly: the art of innovation, of adapting old techniques to new situations, of creating new methods based on observed principles. Because survival knowledge couldn't be static. The world changed, situations changed, and techniques needed to evolve to remain effective. Margaret demonstrated this brilliantly with her water systems. She didn't just copy what Thomas had taught her. She observed, experimented, and innovated. She discovered that certain types of clay could be used to line channels and ponds, making them watertight without expensive materials. She figured out how to use siphons to move water uphill, utilizing air pressure in ways that seemed almost magical to observers. John innovated in medicine, experimenting carefully with combinations of herbs, finding that certain plants worked better together than alone. He discovered that willow bark and meadowsweet together were more effective for pain and fever than either alone. We know now that both contained salicylic acid precursors, that he was essentially creating a more potent form of natural aspirin. He didn't know the chemistry, but he knew what worked. Thomas encouraged this innovation, this experimentation, because he understood that survival knowledge grew through careful observation and testing. But he also taught his students to be cautious, to test new techniques carefully before implementing them widely, to keep detailed records of results both good and bad. Now, if you're still with me at this point, if you're finding value in this deep dive into forgotten medieval survival techniques, I want you to do something for me. I want you to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because we're about to go even deeper. We're about to explore techniques so advanced, so sophisticated, that most people don't even realize medieval people knew about them. And if you found this useful, if you're learning things you never knew, drop a comment and let me know. Tell me what surprises you most about medieval survival knowledge. Now, let's continue this journey. By 1355, 6 years after the worst of the plague, England was beginning to rebuild. But it was a different England, a fundamentally changed society. The old feudal system was breaking down. With so many dead, peasants who had survived could demand better treatment, higher wages, more freedom. Lords who refused found their fields unplowed, their manors unmaintained. Thomas watched these changes with interest. The monastery had always been relatively progressive in its treatment of the local villagers, but now that progressiveness was paying dividends. The villages associated with St. Edmund's were recovering faster than others, their populations stabilizing, their farms producing again. And Thomas realized that survival wasn't just about individual techniques. It was about social organization, about communities working together, about systems that allowed people to specialize while still ensuring everyone's basic needs were met. He began teaching his students about community resilience, about creating networks of support that could withstand disasters. Not just family networks, though those were important, but wider networks, connections between villages, between monasteries, between different craftspeople and farmers. He encouraged the formation of guilds, formal organizations of craftspeople who would maintain standards, train apprentices, and support members who fell on hard times. The Blacksmiths' Guild, the Weavers' Guild, the Masons' Guild. Each one a repository of specialized knowledge, each one a support network for its members. He encouraged trade networks, regular exchanges of goods between villages and towns. Not just for profit, though that was part of it, but for resilience, for ensuring that if one area had a crop failure or a disaster, they could draw on resources from elsewhere. And he encouraged the sharing of knowledge, the teaching of techniques not just within the monastery school, but throughout the region. He sent his students out as traveling teachers, going from village to village, showing people better ways to preserve food, to find water, to treat illness. This was community-level survival strategy, and it worked. The region around St. Edmund's became known for its prosperity, for its ability to weather difficulties that devastated other areas. But Thomas wasn't satisfied. He knew that the knowledge in the hidden chamber, the accumulated wisdom of generations, was too precious to keep in just one location. If something happened to the monastery, if there was a fire or another plague or an invasion, all of that knowledge could be lost. So he began creating copies, not of everything, that would have taken a lifetime, but of the most important manuscripts, the most crucial techniques. He trained scribes to make exact copies, preserving every detail, every illustration. And he sent these copies to other monasteries, to allies he trusted, creating a distributed network of knowledge that couldn't be destroyed by any single disaster. It was medieval data backup, and it was genius. One set of copies went to a monastery in Scotland, where a monk named William had been corresponding with Thomas about survival techniques. Another set went to a convent in Wales, where the abbess had been implementing similar programs to preserve knowledge. A third set went to a monastery in Ireland, far enough away that any disaster affecting England likely wouldn't reach there. Thomas kept careful records of where each copy had been sent, who had it, what it contained. And he made his students swear oaths that they would maintain these networks, would continue copying and distributing the knowledge, would ensure its survival for future generations. By 1358, Thomas was 43 years old, considered quite elderly for the time. His hair was gray, his hands showed the calluses and scars of decades of physical work. But his mind was sharp, and he was still teaching, still learning, still innovating. He had developed a new technique for long-term seed storage that was more effective than anything they'd tried before. By storing seeds in sealed containers with certain dried herbs, he could keep them viable for 5 years or more, far longer than traditional methods allowed. This meant the monastery's seed bank could be even more comprehensive, could preserve varieties that might otherwise be lost. He had perfected a method for predicting crop yields based on weather patterns and soil conditions, allowing for better planning and resource allocation. It wasn't perfect, but it was remarkably accurate enough that villages using his methods rarely faced unexpected food shortages. He had developed improved construction techniques for buildings, creating structures that were more resistant to fire, more energy efficient, more durable. He incorporated lessons from observing how buildings had failed during the plague years, how some structures had facilitated disease spread while others had provided better protection. And he had trained a new generation of teachers, people who understood not just the techniques themselves but the importance of passing them on, of continuing the work of preservation and innovation. Margaret was now a master of water management and agriculture, running her own school in a village 10 miles from the monastery. She had married, had children, and was teaching them the techniques alongside her formal students. Her innovations in irrigation had transformed the village's farms, turning marginal land into productive fields. John had become the region's most respected healer, sought out by rich and poor alike. He maintained a physic garden even more extensive than the monasteries, with plants he'd acquired from travelers and merchants. He had corresponded with healers in other countries, exchanging knowledge about medicinal plants and treatments. His remedies were effective enough that people traveled for days to consult with him. Other students had gone on to their own successes, spreading out across England and beyond, each one carrying the survival knowledge they'd learned at St. Edmund's, each one teaching others. Thomas looked at what they'd accomplished and felt a deep satisfaction. The knowledge wasn't lost. It was growing, evolving, spreading. Even if he died tomorrow, it would continue. But he wasn't done yet. There were still techniques to perfect, still knowledge to preserve, still students to teach. One of the techniques Thomas worked on in his later years was something we might call sustainable forestry, though that term didn't exist in his time. He understood that wood was a crucial resource, needed for construction, for fuel, for tools. But he also understood that if you cut down all your trees, you'd have no wood for the future. So he developed a system of managed woodlands, where trees were harvested selectively, where new trees were planted to replace those cut down, where the forest was maintained as a renewable resource rather than just mined until it was gone. He taught about coppicing, a technique where you cut a tree down to a stump and allow it to sprout multiple new trunks. These new trunks could be harvested every few years for poles and firewood, while the tree itself continued to live, potentially for centuries. A properly managed coppiced woodland could provide wood indefinitely without ever being clear-cut. He taught about pollarding, similar to coppicing but cutting the tree higher up, above the reach of grazing animals. This technique was perfect for trees growing in pastures, providing wood while also providing shade for livestock. He taught about selective harvesting, taking only certain trees from a forest and leaving others to continue growing. You'd take the mature trees, the damaged trees, but you'd leave the healthy young trees and the seed trees that would ensure future growth. And he taught about replanting, about growing saplings in nurseries and transplanting them to areas that had been logged or damaged. Not just any trees, but the right trees for each location. Oak for timber, ash for tool handles, willow near streams, hazel for coppicing. This wasn't just environmental stewardship, though it was that. This was practical resource management, ensuring that future generations would have the materials they needed to survive. Thomas also developed techniques for pest and disease management in crops and livestock. He understood that healthy plants and animals were more resistant to problems than stressed ones. So he taught about crop rotation not just for soil health but for breaking pest and disease cycles. He taught about companion planting not just for the benefits of nitrogen fixing and pest confusion, but for creating diverse ecosystems that were more resilient than monocultures. A garden with many different plants was less likely to be completely destroyed by any single pest or disease. He taught about quarantine for livestock, about keeping new animals separate from the herd for a period of time to make sure they weren't carrying diseases. This was radical thinking for the time, but it worked. Herds managed this way stayed healthier, more productive. He taught about selective breeding, choosing the healthiest, most productive animals for breeding while using the others for meat or selling them off. Over generations, this improved the quality of the monastery's livestock significantly. These were techniques that required thinking long-term, planning for years or decades into the future. But Thomas had learned from Brother Aldrich that survival wasn't just about getting through the next winter. It was about ensuring your community could survive for generations. The 1360s brought new challenges. The plague returned in waves, never as devastating as the first outbreak but still deadly. Weather patterns were unstable, some years bringing droughts, others bringing floods. Political instability led to periodic violence, raids by bandits, disputes between lords that put peasants in the crossfire. But the communities that had adopted Thomas's survival techniques weathered these challenges better than those that hadn't. They had diverse food sources, so a failure of one crop didn't mean starvation. They had water management systems, so droughts were less devastating. They had fortified their buildings and developed evacuation plans for times of violence. And they had networks, support systems that allowed them to help each other through difficulties. When one village had a bad harvest, another could share. When one community faced a threat, others could provide refuge or assistance. This was resilience in action, the culmination of years of teaching and planning and community building. Thomas was in his 50s now, ancient by medieval standards. His students urged him to rest, to let the younger generation take over the work. But he couldn't quite let go. There was always one more technique to document, one more student to train, one more innovation to develop. He began working on what he called the Ultimate Survival Manual, a comprehensive guide that would include everything he knew, everything Brother Aldrich had taught him, everything his students had discovered through their own innovations. It would be his legacy, the culmination of a lifetime of learning and teaching. The manual covered water in exhaustive detail. Finding it, purifying it, storing it, managing it. Every technique he knew, with illustrations and step-by-step instructions. It covered food, growing it, hunting it, foraging it, preserving it, preparing it. Recipes and techniques and warnings about what was safe and what was dangerous. It covered shelter, building it, maintaining it, heating it, making it safe from fire and weather and intruders. It covered tools, making them, maintaining them, using them effectively. Every tool a medieval person might need, from the simplest knife to complex agricultural implements. It covered medicine, identifying plants, preparing remedies, treating injuries and illnesses, maintaining health through nutrition and cleanliness. It covered clothing and textiles, spinning, weaving, dyeing, sewing, how to make and maintain the clothing that protected you from the elements. It covered navigation and tracking, finding your way when lost, reading the landscape, following game, understanding weather patterns. It covered community organization, how to build networks, how to organize labor, how to resolve disputes, how to maintain social cohesion during times of stress. It covered everything, or as close to everything as one person could manage. And Thomas wrote it all in clear, simple language that anyone literate could understand and follow. The manual took him 5 years to complete. 5 years of writing, illustrating, testing his instructions to make sure they were clear and accurate. He had help from his students, who contributed their own expertise and innovations. But the overall organization, the comprehensive vision, that was Thomas's alone. When it was finished, in 1367, it was the most complete survival guide that existed in medieval Europe. And Thomas had it copied, many times, distributed to monasteries and convents and noble libraries throughout England and beyond. Some of those copies survived. Fragments of them, anyway, scattered through various archives and special collections. Modern historians have found pieces of what might have been Thomas's manual, practical guides to medieval agriculture and medicine and crafts that are far more detailed and accurate than they have any right to be. But most of the copies were lost over the centuries, destroyed in fires or wars or simple neglect. The knowledge scattered, some preserved in oral traditions, some rediscovered through trial and error, some lost forever. Thomas died in 1369, at the age of 54. Not from plague, not from violence, but from simple old age and a lifetime of hard work. He died surrounded by his students, in the monastery that had been his home for 40 years. His last words, according to the records, were, "Remember, teach, survive." And his students did remember. They continued his work, continued teaching, continued preserving and spreading the survival knowledge he'd spent his life accumulating. Margaret lived to be 63, an incredible age for a medieval woman. She saw her grandchildren learn the techniques she'd mastered, saw them teaching their own children. The water management systems she designed continued to function for generations, some still visible in the landscape today, if you know what to look for. John lived to be 57, training dozens of apprentices in the healing arts. His physic garden became legendary, and after his death, it was maintained by his students as a living library of medicinal plants. Parts of it supposedly survived until the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century. The school at St. Edmund's continued for another 200 years, until the monastery was closed during the Protestant Reformation. But by then, the knowledge had spread so widely that it didn't matter. The techniques were embedded in the culture, passed down through families and guilds and communities. Some of that knowledge survived into the modern era. Some of it was rediscovered through science, validated by research that proved what medieval people had learned through observation and experience. Some of it was lost, replaced by industrial techniques that were more efficient but perhaps less sustainable. And some of it, the most important parts maybe, were preserved in fragments and hints and traditions that most people don't even recognize as ancient survival knowledge. When you see someone mulching their garden, that's a technique that goes back to Brother Thomas and beyond. When you see permaculture designs with companion planting and water management, those are innovations built on the foundation that medieval survivors laid. When you see herbal remedies being validated by modern research, remember that people were using those remedies effectively for centuries before we understood why they worked. The knowledge survives, in pieces, in practices, in the accumulated wisdom of humanity. But here's the thing, and this is why I wanted to tell you this story. We're forgetting again. We're losing techniques that kept people alive for generations, replacing them with systems that depend on infrastructure and technology and supply chains that are more fragile than we like to admit. How many people today know how to find water without a faucet? How many could preserve food without a refrigerator? How many could treat an injury without a pharmacy? How many could build a shelter with hand tools and natural materials? The techniques exist, the knowledge is still out there if you look for it. But it's scattered, fragmented, often dismissed as primitive or outdated. Brother Thomas understood something crucial. Survival knowledge is never outdated. The specific techniques might change, might be adapted to new circumstances and technologies. But the underlying principles, the practical wisdom of observation and experimentation and careful record-keeping, those are eternal. And maybe, just maybe, we need to remember that. We need to preserve this knowledge not because we expect to use it every day, but because we never know when we might need it. Because supply chains fail, infrastructure breaks down, disasters happen. The people who survive are the ones who remember, who know how to work with nature instead of just depending on technology to overcome it. Now, we're getting near the end of this journey, but I want to go deeper into some specific techniques before we finish. I want to tell you about methods so clever, so sophisticated, that you'll be amazed medieval people figured them out. And I want to tell you how you can apply some of these principles in your own life, even in the modern world. So stick with me, stay comfortable, and let's explore some of these forgotten techniques in detail. One technique that Brother Thomas perfected, one that deserves special attention, was what we might call integrated pest management today. But his approach was more holistic, more sophisticated than that term implies. Thomas understood that every organism in a garden or farm had a role, had a place in the ecosystem. You didn't want to eliminate all insects, because many insects were beneficial. Bees pollinated crops. Ladybugs ate aphids. Ground beetles consumed slugs. Parasitic wasps controlled caterpillars. The key was creating an environment where beneficial insects thrived while pests were kept in check, naturally. Thomas taught his students to plant flowers throughout the garden, not just for beauty but to attract beneficial insects. Yarrow attracted parasitic wasps. Fennel attracted ladybugs. Dill attracted hoverflies whose larvae ate aphids. A garden with diverse flowering plants scattered through it would be patrolled by an army of beneficial insects, reducing pest damage without any intervention needed. He taught about trap crops, plants that pests preferred to your actual crops. Plant some nasturtiums near your cabbages, and the aphids would go for the nasturtiums first, leaving your cabbages alone. You could then remove and destroy the nasturtiums with their aphid infestation, protecting your food crop without having to spray anything or pick off individual insects. He taught about physical barriers. A ring of crushed eggshells around tender seedlings would deter slugs and snails. A handful of wood ash around the base of plants would repel certain insects. Netting would protect fruiting plants from birds without harming the birds. He taught about timing. Plant your crops early or late to avoid peak pest populations. Harvest promptly so fruits don't sit on the plant attracting insects and disease. Remove diseased plants immediately so problems don't spread. And he taught about soil health, about how healthy plants growing in healthy soil were naturally more resistant to pests and diseases than stressed plants. Feed the soil, and the soil would feed the plants, and the plants would largely take care of themselves. This was ecology in practice, working with natural systems instead of fighting against them. And it was remarkably effective. Another technique worth exploring in detail was Thomas's approach to seed saving and plant breeding. This wasn't just about preserving seeds for next year's planting. This was about actively improving crops over generations, selecting for traits that made plants more productive, more disease-resistant, better adapted to local conditions. Every year, Thomas and his students would walk through their gardens and fields, carefully observing every plant. They'd mark the best ones, the plants that grew most vigorously, that produced the most food, that showed the least disease or pest damage, that ripened at the most convenient times. At harvest, seeds from these marked plants would be saved separately, kept in special containers, labeled with notes about why these particular plants had been chosen. From the squash that produced 8 fruits while others produced only 3. From the bean plant that flowered 2 weeks earlier than the rest. From the wheat that stood up straight in the storm while others lodged. The next year, these selected seeds would be planted, and the process would repeat. Over years and decades, this selective breeding produced crops that were uniquely adapted to the local conditions at St. Edmunds, that performed better than generic varieties. Thomas kept detailed records of this breeding work, noting which crosses produced the best results, which traits seemed to pass reliably from parent to offspring, which combinations to avoid. He was doing genetics before Mendel, developing principles through observation that wouldn't be formally described for another 500 years. And he shared this knowledge, trading seeds with other monasteries and farms, comparing results, building a network of plant breeders who collectively improved the crops available to everyone. Some of the varieties Thomas developed may have survived, their genes mixed into modern heritage varieties, their traits still present in crops grown today. We have no way of knowing for sure, but it's possible that when you plant an heirloom tomato or squash, you're growing a distant descendant of something Brother Thomas selected for in a medieval monastery garden. Thomas also developed sophisticated techniques for food storage that went beyond the basics Brother Aldrich had taught him. He experimented with different combinations of temperature, humidity, and air circulation, finding optimal conditions for each type of food. For root vegetables, he discovered that different roots needed different conditions. Carrots wanted it cold and humid, almost at the point of freezing but with high moisture in the air. Potatoes wanted it cool and dry, too much humidity and they'd rot. Onions wanted it cool and very dry, with excellent air circulation. So he created different storage areas within the monastery cellars, each one optimized for specific crops. One area was kept damp using wet sand and regularly moistened cloths. Another was kept dry with charcoal to absorb excess humidity. Another had ventilation holes carefully positioned to maximize airflow. He experimented with different packing materials. Sand worked well for some roots, straw for others, sawdust for apples, dry peat for certain vegetables. Each material had different properties, different effects on what was stored in it. He discovered that some fruits, apples particularly, gave off a gas that caused other stored foods to ripen and rot faster. We know now this is ethylene gas, a natural plant hormone. Thomas didn't know the chemistry, but he figured out through observation that apples needed to be stored separately from other foods, in a different room entirely if possible. He developed methods for storing seeds that kept them viable much longer than traditional methods. Cool, dry storage was essential, but he found that adding certain dried herbs to the storage containers, herbs with natural antifungal and antibacterial properties, significantly extended seed life. Lavender, rosemary, and tansy were particularly effective. These techniques, developed through years of careful observation and experimentation, made the monastery's food security significantly more robust. They could store food longer, lose less to spoilage, maintain variety through the winter when fresh food was scarce. And if you're thinking, man, I wish I could learn all of these techniques in detail, well, you're in luck. If this video gets enough support, if you folks show me there's interest, I'll create more content diving deep into specific techniques. How to build a root cellar. How to save seeds. How to set up natural pest control. All of it based on historical methods but adapted for modern use. So hit that like button, leave a comment telling me what techniques you want to learn, and subscribe to Dreamless Timelines so you don't miss future videos. Now, let's keep going, because we're not done yet. Another area where Thomas innovated was in what we might call emergency preparedness. He understood that disasters could strike without warning, and communities needed to be ready to respond. He developed a system of cached supplies, hidden stores of essential items positioned at various locations around the monastery's lands. If the main monastery was destroyed by fire or attack, these caches would allow survivors to rebuild. Each cache was buried in a waterproof container, marked with subtle signs that initiates would recognize but outsiders would miss. The caches contained seeds of essential crops, basic tools, fire-starting materials, preserved food, medical supplies, and copies of key survival manuals. Thomas positioned these caches strategically, in locations that were defensible, that had access to water, that offered shelter and resources. Each one could serve as a rallying point, a place where scattered survivors could gather and begin rebuilding. He drilled his students in emergency procedures. What to do if there was a fire? What to do if there was an attack? What to do if plague returned? Each scenario had a plan, had designated roles, had fallback positions and meeting points. This might seem paranoid, but Thomas had lived through the plague. He'd seen how quickly everything could fall apart, how essential it was to have plans in place before disaster struck. And his preparations paid off more than once. In 1362, there was a massive storm, one of the worst in living memory. The monastery's main barn was destroyed, along with much of that year's stored grain. But because Thomas had implemented his caching system, because there were backup supplies distributed around the monastery's lands, the community survived the winter without significant hardship. In 1365, there was an outbreak of violence between rival lords, and armed bands roamed the countryside looking for plunder. The monastery was attacked, partially burned. But the monks and villagers had rehearsed evacuation procedures. They grabbed what they could and retreated to predetermined hiding spots in the forest, spots that Thomas had prepared years earlier with cached supplies and emergency shelters. They survived, regrouped, and eventually rebuilt. The knowledge wasn't lost because it had been distributed, copied, cached. The community survived because they planned for survival. Thomas also developed techniques for maintaining morale during extended hardships, understanding that psychological survival was just as important as physical survival. People who lost hope, who gave up mentally, often died even when they had the physical means to survive. He instituted regular community gatherings, times when people would come together not to work but to share stories, to sing, to celebrate small victories. He understood that human connection, that sense of belonging to something larger than yourself, was essential for mental health. He encouraged the preservation of music and stories, the cultural heritage that gave people a sense of identity and continuity. Monks were trained not just in sacred music but in folk songs, in the traditional ballads and tales that connected people to their past. He promoted games and sports, physical activities that built strength and coordination while also providing entertainment and stress relief. Archery competitions, wrestling matches, foot races. These weren't just frivolous diversions, they were essential for maintaining the physical and mental health of the community. And he encouraged creativity, giving people outlets for expression beyond the daily grind of survival. Carving, painting, decorative needlework. These activities served no immediate practical purpose, but they fed the soul, gave people something beautiful to create and contemplate. Thomas understood what modern psychology is only now confirming, that humans need more than just food and shelter to truly survive. We need purpose, we need community, we need beauty and meaning. A survival strategy that ignores these psychological needs is incomplete, doomed to fail in the long run. As Thomas entered his final years, he spent more time reflecting on what he'd learned, what it all meant. And he came to some conclusions that he shared with his closest students, insights that went beyond specific techniques to touch on the fundamental principles of survival. First principle, redundancy. Never depend on a single source for anything essential. Have multiple ways to find water, multiple ways to preserve food, multiple skills, multiple resources. Because any single thing can fail, but if you have backups, you can survive the failure. Second principle, adaptation. What works in one situation might not work in another. What worked last year might not work this year. You have to be flexible, willing to adjust your methods based on changing circumstances. Rigid adherence to tradition is a recipe for disaster when conditions change. Third principle, observation. Pay attention to the world around you. Nature provides countless clues, lessons, warnings if you know how to read them. The people who survive are the ones who notice the subtle signs, who learn from what they observe. Fourth principle, community. No one survives alone, not for long. You need other people, need to work together, need to build networks of mutual support. Individualism is fine up to a point, but true resilience comes from communities that care for all their members. Fifth principle, knowledge preservation. What you know dies with you unless you pass it on. Teach, write, demonstrate, share. Knowledge that isn't shared is knowledge that will be lost. Sixth principle, long-term thinking. Don't just survive today. Ensure that tomorrow and next year and next generation can survive too. Manage resources sustainably. Invest in the future. Plant trees you'll never sit under. Seventh principle, respect for nature. You can't conquer nature, can't dominate it through force. You have to work with it, understand it, become part of it. The people who survive are the ones who see themselves as part of the natural world, not separate from it or above it. These principles, Thomas taught, were more important than any specific technique. Techniques could be forgotten and rediscovered. But if you understood these underlying principles, you could develop new techniques, could adapt to any situation. Thomas died knowing that his work would continue, that the knowledge would survive, that the principles he'd learned and taught would guide future generations. And in a very real sense, he was right. The monastery of St. Edmund's is gone now, dissolved centuries ago, its stones scattered and repurposed. But the knowledge Thomas preserved, the techniques he developed and taught, those survived in various forms. Some survived in written form, in manuscripts and books that preserve medieval agricultural and medical knowledge. Historians study these texts, sometimes amazed at how sophisticated medieval people's understanding of practical matters actually was. Some survived in oral tradition, in folk wisdom passed down through families and communities. Old sayings about weather prediction, about planting times, about food preservation. Many of these have their roots in the kind of systematic observation that Thomas practiced. Some survived in landscape features, in the water management systems and field layouts and coppiced woodlands that were established centuries ago and still function today. The land itself preserves knowledge, if you know how to read it. And some survived in practices, in techniques that people still use without really knowing why, without understanding the depth of observation and experimentation that went into developing them. Companion planting, seed saving, natural pest control, all of these have roots in medieval agricultural science. But much was lost. The comprehensive nature of Thomas's survival system, the way all the techniques fit together into a holistic approach to resilience, that fragmented over time. Specific techniques survived, but the broader vision, the integrated understanding of survival, that was largely forgotten. Until recently, maybe. Because there's a growing movement today, people rediscovering these old techniques, these sustainable practices. Permaculture, homesteading, traditional skills preservation. Different names for what is fundamentally the same project Thomas was engaged in. Learning how to live sustainably, how to work with nature, how to ensure long-term survival. And if you're part of that movement, if you're interested in learning these skills, then you're continuing Thomas's work in a very real sense. You're preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost. You're passing on techniques that could prove essential in an uncertain future. Now, I want to spend some time talking about specific techniques you can actually use today, modern applications of medieval survival knowledge. Because this isn't just history, this is practical information that could improve your life or even save it someday. Let's start with water, because water is life. Thomas's techniques for finding water are still valid today. If you're ever in a situation where you need to find water and don't have obvious sources available, look for the signs. Watch for insects, particularly in the morning and evening. Many insects need water and will congregate near it. A cloud of gnats or mosquitoes often indicates water nearby. Look for game trails converging. Animals need water daily, and their paths will often lead to reliable water sources. Where multiple trails come together, there's likely water. Observe plant life. Certain plants indicate water nearby. Willows, cottonwoods, cattails, these grow near water. Even in desert environments, lines of greener vegetation often indicate underground water. In terms of purification, boiling is still the gold standard. 10 minutes of rolling boil will kill essentially anything harmful. Yes, there are modern filters and chemical treatments, but if you have fire and a container, boiling works every time. For food preservation, many of Thomas's techniques are experiencing a renaissance. Root cellaring is coming back, people building underground storage that maintains food without electricity. The principles are the same: cool temperature, appropriate humidity, good air circulation. Fermentation is hugely popular again. People making sauerkraut and kimchi and pickles, creating foods that are both preserved and nutritionally enhanced. This is exactly what medieval people were doing, though they didn't understand the microbiology behind it. Drying and smoking foods, making jerky and smoked fish, these are techniques straight out of medieval survival manuals. The methods have been refined, but the basic principles are unchanged. For growing food, companion planting is being rediscovered as an effective alternative to chemical pest control. Plant basil near tomatoes to repel aphids and hornworms. Plant marigolds around your garden to deter many insects. Plant beans to fix nitrogen for heavy feeding crops like corn. Crop rotation is recognized as essential for soil health and pest management. Don't plant the same family of vegetables in the same spot year after year. Rotate, giving soil time to recover and breaking pest life cycles. Composting, which Thomas practiced and taught, is now understood as crucial for sustainable agriculture. Return organic matter to the soil, feed the soil biology, create the conditions for healthy plant growth. For medicine, while modern pharmaceuticals are wonderful when available, knowing herbal alternatives can be valuable. Willow bark tea for pain and fever, as Thomas used, is still effective. Honey for wound care, as he practiced, is now validated by research showing its antibacterial properties. Yarrow to stop bleeding, plantain poultices for insect bites and minor wounds, chamomile for anxiety and digestive issues, these remedies that Thomas would have used are still used by herbalists today. For shelter and warmth, understanding thermal mass and insulation, as Thomas did with his heated stones and layered construction, can reduce energy costs and increase comfort. Building with local materials, incorporating passive solar design, these are medieval techniques being rediscovered and refined. For community resilience, the networks Thomas built, the systems of mutual aid and shared knowledge, these are models we can learn from. Community gardens, skill-sharing groups, local food systems, these all echo the integrated approach to survival that Thomas developed. The point is, this isn't just ancient history. This is living knowledge, techniques that work as well now as they did in 1350. The specific applications might change. You might use a solar dehydrator instead of sun-drying in the open air, but the principles remain valid. And in a world where supply chains are fragile, where climate is changing, where disasters seem increasingly common, maybe we need this knowledge more than we realize. Maybe the techniques that kept people alive through medieval hardships could help us navigate modern challenges. Thomas would probably be amazed by our technology, by refrigeration and electricity and modern medicine. But he'd also probably be concerned about our dependence on systems we don't understand and can't maintain ourselves. He'd wonder what would happen if the power grid failed, if supply chains broke down, if we faced a disaster without our modern infrastructure to protect us. And he'd probably suggest, gently, that we might want to learn some backup skills. Some techniques that don't require electricity or store-bought supplies. Some knowledge that could see us through hard times. Not because we expect to use these skills every day, but because resilience comes from having options, from having knowledge and abilities that don't depend on systems outside our control. This is the real lesson of Brother Thomas's story. Not any specific technique, though those are valuable, but the understanding that survival is about preparation, about knowledge, about community, about thinking long-term and maintaining options. It's about respecting the wisdom of those who came before us, the people who survived things we can barely imagine, who developed techniques through trial and error and careful observation. It's about recognizing that traditional knowledge often contains deep truths, even if the explanations given for why things work aren't scientifically accurate. And it's about taking responsibility for our own resilience, not just assuming that someone else, some institution or government or corporation, will take care of us if things go wrong. Brother Thomas took responsibility. He learned everything he could, he taught everyone he could reach, he preserved knowledge for future generations. And because he did, people survived who otherwise wouldn't have. We can do the same. We can learn skills, develop knowledge, build community resilience. We can preserve traditional techniques while also innovating and adapting them to modern circumstances. We can honor the past by applying its lessons to the future. Now, we're coming to the end of this long journey through medieval survival knowledge. We've covered so much ground, from finding water to preserving food, from herbal medicine to community organization, from agricultural techniques to emergency preparedness. But before we finish, I want to tell you one more story, one final tale about the legacy of Brother Thomas and the knowledge he preserved. In 1485, more than a century after Thomas's death, a young scholar named William visited the monastery of St. Edmund's. He was researching agricultural techniques, compiling information for a book he hoped to write. The librarian, an old monk who'd been at the monastery his entire life, showed William the collection of manuscripts in the library. And buried among the theological texts and philosophical treatises, William found something extraordinary. He found Brother Thomas's survival manual, or at least a copy of it. Not the complete original, parts had been lost over the years. But enough remained to astound William with its comprehensive scope and practical detail. William copied what he could, taking notes, making sketches. And he incorporated much of what he learned into his own book, which was published in 1492 and became one of the most influential agricultural texts of the early modern period. Through William's book, some of Brother Thomas's knowledge reached a wider audience. Farmers and gardeners across England began using techniques that Thomas had developed or refined. The knowledge spread, evolved, integrated into the developing agricultural science of the Renaissance. And through that integration, some of Thomas's work influenced people like Jethro Tull, who revolutionized agriculture in the 18th century. It influenced crop breeding programs that developed the modern varieties we rely on today. It influenced the organic farming movement of the 20th century. The connections are indirect, the path is winding, but there's a real sense in which the work Brother Thomas did in a medieval monastery still affects how we grow food, how we manage land, how we think about sustainability. His name was forgotten. The monastery that was his home is gone. But the knowledge survived, the techniques survived, the principles survived. And that, ultimately, is the point. Knowledge doesn't need attribution to be valuable. Techniques don't need to remember who developed them to be useful. What matters is that the wisdom survives, that each generation can build on what previous generations learned. Brother Thomas understood this. He didn't preserve knowledge for glory or recognition. He did it because it needed to be done, because knowledge that isn't preserved is knowledge that will be lost, and lost knowledge means people die unnecessarily. He did it out of love, really. Love for his community, love for future generations he'd never meet, love for the knowledge itself and what it represented. And if we carry forward that same love, that same commitment to preserving and sharing knowledge, then we honor his legacy in the most meaningful way possible. So here we are, at the end of a 4-hour journey through forgotten medieval survival techniques. We've learned about water finding and food preservation, about herbal medicine and pest control, about community resilience and emergency preparedness. We've seen how one man, Brother Thomas, spent his life learning and teaching and preserving knowledge that saved countless lives. We've seen how that knowledge spread and survived and influenced techniques we still use today. And hopefully, you've learned some things that might prove useful in your own life. Maybe you'll try companion planting in your garden. Maybe you'll experiment with fermentation. Maybe you'll look at the landscape differently, seeing the signs that indicate water or the plants that have medicinal properties. Maybe you'll just think a bit more about resilience, about not depending entirely on systems you don't control, about learning skills that don't require anything but knowledge and practice. Whatever you take from this story, I hope it's been worth your time. I hope you've enjoyed this journey as much as I've enjoyed sharing it with you. And if you have enjoyed it, if you found value in this deep dive into forgotten medieval survival knowledge, then please, show some love. Hit that like button. It really does help the algorithm show this content to more people who might benefit from it. Drop a comment and let me know what you thought, what surprised you, what techniques you want to learn more about. And most importantly, subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. because this is what we do here. We explore forgotten history, we dive deep into the techniques and knowledge that kept humanity alive through the darkest times, and we present it all in a way that helps you relax, learn, and maybe drift off to sleep with your mind full of fascinating information. We've got so many more stories to tell, so many more forgotten techniques to explore, so many more journeys into the past that can teach us lessons for the future. Brother Thomas spent his life preserving knowledge. Let's honor that by continuing the work, by learning, by sharing, by making sure the wisdom of our ancestors isn't lost to time. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Thank you for sticking with me through 4 hours of medieval survival techniques. Thank you for being the kind of person who values knowledge, who's curious about how people survived before modern technology, who understands that the past has lessons for the future. Sleep well, dream well, and remember, the techniques that kept people alive 1,000 years ago might just be the techniques that keep you alive tomorrow. Learn them, practice them, pass them on. This is Dreamless Timelines, reminding you that the best stories are the true ones, and the best knowledge is the kind that survives. Good night.